And so now it's time to put the pyramid on top of it that we are going to use a different type of generator to turn into this lattice structure. And it's not going to look exactly like that, but we're going to get it somewhat close again, right? We're doing this quickly and just with primitives. So let's go ahead and create a pyramid. So we come over, we open up our generator, or sorry, our primitives, go to pyramid. Again, our pyramid is really low on the screen, and it's huge. So I'm going to pull it up some so it's more visible. And you'll notice that the pyramid properties look a little different, right? It's got these three sizes. They're not aligned with any particular axis right now. They're not aligned with X, Y, or Z. And that's because it depends on the orientation. If we set the orientation here, it's a little bit different. But basically, this is your X size, this is your height, and this is your Z depth, right? So if I set this to 10, you'll see that it gets really skinny, but it stays tall. And if I set this one to 10, right now I've got something that is 10 by 10 by 200, right? So if we needed a really tall radio tower on here, we could do that. But if we look at the image, it's maybe 20 or 25 tall. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 25. Oh, no, it's bigger than that. Let's set it to 35. And then I'm going to adjust it so that it sits on top of that tower. Okay. And now, because it's not, I know it's not quite lined up where I want it, I'm going to go back to my front view. And I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to hit S and then zoom out a touch. And then pull this down until it touches that surface. Okay. And so now I've got this solid pyramid. Now the other thing is, right, that radio tower may only have 3 sides. This one has 4 sides. But again, we're doing this quickly. So now we're going to use a different generator to create that skeletal structure. And so to do that, we're going to go to this thing that says subdivision surface, click and hold, and we're going to go to atom array. And then we're going to make the pyramid a child of the atom array. Right? And as soon as we do that, we get this like big chunky thing that's happening. So I'm going to click on the atom array so it's selected. And then my properties here are cylinder radius and sphere radius. I'm going to set my cylinder radius to 0.5 centimeters. And I'm going to set my sphere radius to 1. Right? And maybe that's a little small. Maybe I should do 1 for this and maybe 1.5 for those. It just makes it a little easier to see. And so, oops. So then, okay. So then you'll notice that, right, I've got this thing, but it's really empty and basic. Okay, so I've got my settings set the way I want them. However, you'll notice that this thing is it's an empty pyramid. It doesn't have any of kind of the lattice structure that we would like it to have. And so what I need to do is I need to select my pyramid, and I need to change the number of segments. If I increase the number of segments to 2, you'll see that suddenly I have a lot more geometry happening in here, right? So if I rotate around, you can see now I've got a nice set of triangles there. If I go back to the reference, you can see I actually do need to make this smaller, and I could count these, but it looks like if I set it to maybe 8, it would be a good facsimile. So I'm going to set this to 8 segments. And when I do that, right, maybe that's a bit too much. Let's start with 4, right? But it's still just way too dense. So I'm going to go back to my atom array. I'm going to set my cylinder radius to 0.5, and I'm going to set my sphere radius to 0.75. Right? And so now maybe this is again still too dense. Oh, that should be 8. There we go. This is maybe still too dense, so I'm going to go back to my atom array, sorry, I'm going to go back to my pyramid, and maybe I just need 3 segments. That might just visually look better from a distance. Right? It doesn't matter how accurate it is. It looks more or less like a radio tower. When I have the pyramid selected, I could say, oh, I actually want this to be a little bit taller. Or perhaps I want these, I want the base to be a little bit broader so it actually goes out to the edges and takes up a bit more space. And so now I have the basics of this tower done. There's one more step I want to show you, and then I'm going to call it. And there's a couple details we may or may not get to. We'll see. Okay, so we're going to create these archways really quick, and we're not going to put glass or anything in the ends of them. We're just going to leave them open for now. And so to create those arches, we're going to, again, we're going to go back to that file that we created to do the array with our railing. So I'm going to go back to Untitled 6. I'm actually going to delete my cylinders. I'm going to leave the railing support array because we're going to use it in just a little bit. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a tube. This tube is huge, so I'm going to go ahead and make it smaller because I know it's going to need to be significantly smaller. And so I know that the height is probably only going to need to be maybe 20, or let's set it to 30 to start with. And I know that the inner radius, if we go and we look at our reference, what we're creating are these arches. And so I know that inner radius is going to be significantly smaller than 50. So let's go ahead and make that 25. And then we're going to make the outer radius, because this is really thin, we're just going to we'll make it 30 to start with, right? Which is still probably too thick. And then we also know that we don't want this to be laying flat. We want it to be on its side. So we're going to change our orientation to X plus. And then there is one tab that we haven't dealt with in any objects, but any round primitive allows you to do what's called slice. The exception is a sphere, but every other thing else allows you to slice it. And so if I click on slice and I check mark the slice box, what it does is it essentially cuts the object in half. And it starts at 0 and it ends at 180. Or I don't know if this is 0 and this is 180. We're going to find out really soon. And so what you can do is to adjust where the slice is. And we want this arch to be basically, from the ground plane over to the ground plane. So I know it either needs to be 90. Okay, so it needs to be 90, and then this probably needs to be 270. There we go. And so we've now got this set. And at this point, right, we've got, we have this set. Now, if I go to scale it, right, because what I'd like to do is squish it in this direction to make it a little narrower. But you'll notice that when I do that, it's uniformly scaling. And that is kind of a problem. Okay, so what we are going to do, because what we want this to be squished a little bit, right? We want it to be a little bit taller, a little bit narrower. Now, if, the way I would usually model this is I would go to, I'd make it a polygon object and then make some adjustments there, and that would work pretty well. However, what we're going to do instead is we're going to use a deformer to deform the shape of this primitive. And to do that, we've got our primitive, we've got our tube, and I have this other one up here so I can double check my settings when I go through this again. So we're going to take this tube and we're going to create a deformer. Now, deformers are available under this object called the bend object, which does exactly that. It bends things. And when the one we want is called squash and stretch. right? Bulge might work as well, but it kind of squash and stretch does a little bit better job making this look cleaner. So I'm going to go to squash and stretch. And the way that squash and stretch works, any deformer that you create, you want it to be a child of the object that you are deforming. So the tube is my object. So I'm going to click on this squash and stretch, and I'm going to drag it down until that arrow points down. And I'm going to drop it in as a child of the tube. Now, once I've made it a child of the tube, there's a couple settings I set on the tube. You'll notice first, if I went to display and I turned on Gerard shading lines, so I could actually see the lines here, the different subdivisions. And then also my, this was, I believe the settings were 16 and maybe 4 cap segments and 4 height segments, right? And so the height segments are these segments, and the cap segments are these, and the rotation are the ones that go around the outside, right? So I'm up to my rotations to 36. And, we could up the height as well, but in this case it doesn't matter because really we're trying to limit the amount we deform it to side to sideways, but not vertical, but not in any other dimension. And so I'm going to click on the squash and stretch object now. And the first thing I'm going to do under this object tab is at the very bottom, there's this fit to parent. So I'm going to go ahead and fit it to the parent object. And notice that I have this purple cross here, and a purple line. That is my deformer. Those are the bounds of my deformer. And because even though we've sliced this, the other part of the object is essentially just invisible here, and it keeps it the same size. And that's not really going to mess with us too much. So now let's go ahead and start tweaking some settings here. The two that are going to make a big difference to start with are factor and expand. If I click on factor, right, and I make it, if I go less than 100%, it's going to smear it out to the sides. If I go more than 100%, right, it's going to lift it up. And you'll notice that it does also bring the bottom edge together and spread the top edge out some. My factor here, 120%, seems to be about right. And then the expand option, oops, that's smooth start, sorry. The expand option, right, either it shrinks the feet in or it expands the feet out, right? If I pull this down to 0, it's basically the same shape, right? So in this case, leaving this at about, 100% actually makes it, pretty happy. It's a little bit, this whole thing's a little thicker than I would like it to be. But we can fix that. If we look at some of these other settings, the top is currently at 30, right? If I was to lower the top, you'll see that it makes a change to how this thing works. If I raise the top up, I'm going to get a smoother arch, right? The arch flattens here some, but if I raise it up, I can get a smoother arch. So I'm going to set that to 45. And then the center really just depends on, right, where the center of the effect is. And you can see that that makes some changes. I'm going to set it to 0%, so it's just where it should be. And again, the bottom is also going to make similar adjustments, and I'm just going to leave that where it is, which was -30. The aspect is basically this other setting here lets you fully expand it to its normal dimensions or makes it squished. And so we actually want our aspect, if we set it to -100%, it seems to be closest to what we want in our reference image, right? It's a little, these are a little taller and narrower, but we're just doing this to test these things out, so I'm not too worried about it. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to go back to my tube, and where I have the inner radius set to 25 and the outer radius set to 30, I'm going to up my inner radius to 27.5 so that it's a little bit thinner. Right, so it doesn't, oops, and then I'm going to undo what I just did because I keep making that same mistake. All right, so this basically makes things a little bit thinner, a little bit cleaner, and it gets me into a pretty good spot in terms of how I want this to look. So now that I've got this one object, what I need to do is now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the railing support array, and I'm going to make the tube a child of the railing support. Now, you're going to notice that there's a lot of things going on here. One, there's a lot of copies. So let's go ahead and select our railing support, and instead of having 36, we only need, I believe, based on the reference, we need 4 of these. So we're going to say 4. Now, if I do 4 copies and you actually look at this, you're going to see that I'm actually getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 copies. So what I really need is the original and 3 copies, and then I get a total of 4. Now, the other thing you're going to notice is that they are not aligned the way I would like them to be aligned. And so this is one of the failings of the array object, is that it really forces you to have objects in a particular orientation. If I go to my tube and I say, okay, well, now I want to rotate it, and I go to rotate this tube, the copies don't rotate, right? It essentially loses all of its freedom. And this is one of the times when a null object is really useful. So I'm going to go up to the Create menu at the top of the screen. I'm going to create a null. I'm going to make the tube a child of the null object. And then I'm going to take the null and make the null a child of the railing support. Now, once I've done that, if I select my tube and I rotate my tube, now, and I rotate it 90 degrees, and I do it precisely by holding down the Shift key while I do this, now I can rotate those objects, because what the array object does is it essentially locks the rotation position and everything of whatever object is its child, but anything that's a child of that null object is free to have its position, rotation, and everything changed. So this is one of the times when using a null object is needed in order to have the freedom to do the things that you want to do. So now that I've got this set, I am going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to go back to my original project, and I'm going to paste it. And then with making sure I have the railing support selected, I'm going to pull this up. And right, so these are about the right size. They're a little wide, but you know, we're taking some creative liberties, so who cares? But the diameter's a little bit big, right? So we need to take our radius and shrink it, and I'm not sure how much to shrink it, but let's just go ahead until we go down. It looks like 36 is pretty good. And again, you could create, you could do the same thing. You could create discs and or cylinders and use the same settings with squash and stretch and the railing support to put glass in there. But we are not going to do that right now. Okay, so this is a good point to save the file. Something that Cinema4D likes to do is crash. So it's always good to save things once you've gotten a good amount of work done. Please don't forget to do that. It's so frustrating when the whole program crashes and you lose hours of work. And then I'm going to rename this railing support to, you know, Windows or something like that. Okay. I'm going to pause again because I'm dying inside.